This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Fantastic. A wide range of interests around the table. What I want to talk about tonight is, I suppose, partly a personal reflection of my journey from what started out as an academic career in medieval state finance and fiscal history, with a particular focus on 1225, into a more broad-ranging approach to, I suppose we call it public history today, but it's much more from the practitioner's side. So if we are going to call this anything, it's the practitioner's tale. The rather grand title, The Personal Heritage Research Environment of the 21st Century, allows me to bring together a number of observations about how the practice of research, the dissemination of research, and also the way that the academy is reaching out to a large research community has fundamentally changed, certainly over the 12-13 years that I've been involved much more with the broadcast media side of things. And I'd like to use tonight to observe some of the changes, have a look at some of the influences and drivers behind those changes, and then look a little bit about the impact, what this means for both sides of the fence, what it means for the practitioners who have been doing their own thing for a number of years but have now suddenly found the landscape change, but also the opportunities that this provides for the academy to reach out to a different constituent group and in many ways start to deliver real and meaningful impact. And I have a number of case studies about how this works in practice that I'd like to share with you. I guess the first thing to address really is, what is personal heritage? I'll be intrigued when we do the Q&A whether this is a phrase you've come across before or are familiar with. It's one that I first came across and started to coin about 8 years or so ago, having worked on programmes like Who Do You Think You Are, House Detectives, and got involved with a number of representative organisations, the British Association for Local History, Society of Genealogists and the like. And for me, this artificial segregation of approaches to history, which all shared the same common denominator, which was that it was more of a worm's eye bottom-up view, as opposed to quite a lot of the more traditional academic top-down approach, particularly when you see on television, was that they were missing a trick. And if you really want to spend some time researching your family, for example, you have to place them at a particular point in time, and you have to also look at the environment that surrounded them. So in many ways this strays into social history, local history, property history, and it also starts to get rid of some of the unwelcome connotations around labels such as genealogist. In the period before I'm really talking about, a genealogist was someone who was recently retired, they've got a lot of time and stories on their hands, and they're going out researching their ancestors, usually collecting them all together like a form of philately, and just seeing how many they can get on one large family tree. And in many ways, this sort of impression of a genealogist continued when the first series of Who Do You Think You Are first came out in 2004. One of the reviewers called it self-indulgent navel-gazing. And at the time, Tristram Hunt, before he moved into politics and was then an academic TV historian, called it warm bath television. Something you lie in for an hour and come out a bit wrinkly, and none being reached at the end of the process. So there was this rather sort of condescending view of what a genealogist actually was. So it's a hobby, it's a pastime. And actually, as I'll show very shortly, through my own personal experience of moving from one side to the other, it was anything but. But what I've tried to do with this phrase personal heritage is elevate the research skills that are required to investigate an element of the past that perhaps the mainstream academic has traditionally not been that interested in, the minutiae of family life. Nowadays, as a result of some of the changes I'll hopefully come to describe, it is far more fascinating than ever before, and we're finding that the cache of material, the personal archive that is unearthed by the genealogist or the personal historian, suddenly adds a completely new weight of evidence and meaning to some of the top-level research that has been done up until that point. And if you think back into my period, certainly in the medieval age, a lot of the records are created by central government or the great and the good, the aristocratic families who required records to manage their estates or conduct their affairs or communicate. It was very much that top-down, which then of course is where the historians have focused their attention. But actually, when we do find a cache of personal letters or household accounts, they are fascinating because first of all they give voice to another part of the community that has often been eroded from official histories through the ages. but also tell us how stuff actually works. Maybe that is the financial and economic historian coming out of me, but when you start pouring through tradesmen's bills and the cost of meats and butter, particularly during harsh winters, and how people would then struggle to survive, that is the real nitty-gritty history. And that in many ways is what people go looking for when they start researching their personal heritage. So I like the phrase, it gets us out of this narrow definition of simply finding a house and researching it, or looking at a community and just spending all your time trying to work out what happened when, or taking a family and building a family tree. It's more than that, it's all of that. It's about nuance when you come to put a research piece together. So that's personal heritage, and I'll come back to that theme on a number of occasions. I suppose my observations about this tension between the academy and the personal heritage historian first came to fruition when I realised that my obsession with the 13th century state finances from 1225 wasn't really going to lead me to gainful employment, and I ended up working for the host for the records I was so fascinated in, the Public Record Office, as was the National Archives, as we call it today. And at the time they were trying to assemble a new inquiry service, particularly breaking down the records into period, and I was brought in to work on the medieval and early modern records. And so I thought that my role would be to help other academics coming into the archive, the place where the records were kept, and to enable their research to again whittle away at these obscurities of the past. However, the reality was completely different, and I found that most people coming up to the inquiry desks were not interested in the mechanics of the medieval exchequer, much to my disappointment. Actually, what they wanted to find out about was where they can find the record of transportation for their 2 times great-grandparents who'd stolen something and was sent off in chains to Australia. Where can they find this information? And that's where I suddenly realised that the importance of history is more than just the top-level minutiae. History does matter. It was one of those road to Damascus moments. Now, working in an archive is a challenging thing. It is very difficult to get started, particularly if you've had no formal training. Yet here were hundreds, thousands of people around the country marching up, trying to tackle often very poorly catalogued material with their own challenges around format and means of access, simply to find stuff about themselves or their ancestors. They were being compelled to do this for a whole range of different motivations. And motivation is something that I will come back to, because that's something I think where we can start to use our research budgets to try and work out why people are motivated to take an interest in this, and then start to find various solutions, projects and products to help them to better society. And that's where some of the case studies at the end will come in. But the motivation wasn't to get a PhD or to do a piece of study. It was simply to find out more about themselves and their relationship with the past, often sparked by realising that they are now the top of the family tree, the passing away of an elderly relative, and the fact that the stories that pass from generation to generation have now cut off, or been given, as a result of that process, an archive they never knew existed. Photographs, letters, journals, diaries, family heirlooms, something that they wanted to find out more about, so there's a curiosity being sparked. Or often, it was trying to shine a light into the dark corners of uncertainty, the things that people simply wouldn't talk about, which of course, like a moth to a flame, is where we want to focus our attention. And there were all sorts of caveats about peering too deeply into one's own personal background. I found a few years ago that I was related to a Soviet spy, hence the book The Forgotten Spy, so he's done me quite well in the end. So the first impression was that these people were coming in and they were joyful, they were happy, they were excited. There were shrieks of delight in the austere reading rooms as people found things out that they never knew existed. So there was a passion about this research that sometimes you might not always get if you're plodding away counting medieval exchequer, receipt and account rolls. It is quite methodical. You have an end result, you have the research question. For these people it was an instant gratification, an instant discovery, which meant something to them. That personalisation of research and the outcome was something that is very hard to replicate in other fields. So there's something there that we perhaps need to recognise. There's also a level of sophistication in the research techniques and methodology involved. Again, this sense that it's just a hobby, anyone can do it. You turn up at an archive, you find the stuff and that's it. You get all your scraps of paper and you keep it in a box. You write up your family tree on a sheet of wallpaper as in the old way. Some of that is true, but the way people tackle this is very interesting because it does mirror a research methodology that we can help support and perhaps should also try and adopt ourselves. And I'm doing a number of sessions elsewhere where we're going back to the ethos of the archive and particularly research techniques and trying to adopt some of the practices of family, local, social history and apply them at PhD training level, because some of those have been lost by the move today towards online search. And of course, as I'll come back to, search is very different to research, and sometimes that message gets confused. So let's just break down the typical family historian's journey. Firstly, there was the research question. What do I want to find out? What is my motivation? Where am I going to find the answers? So there's an appraisal process in actually trying to work out where they're going to go to get that information. A lot of the time it starts with the family unit. Who can I ask? Is there a relative that can provide me with that information, oral history? They often then record it these days. So there's a really nice oral history capture exercise that is going on amongst us, which we're not actually embracing or trying to do anything with. There's a vast amount of oral history which doesn't appear in community projects that have been set up by academic communities. It's locked away within the family archive. And it's an amazing account. I've worked with private clients to create these things and I've tried to encourage them to deposit material where possible in film and sound archives, but it's still that sense that it's personal, it's private, it's mine, not realising there is a greater use to a wider research community. We have also, as I've alluded to already, the personal archive, the physical materials that are gathered together through someone's journey through life. A lot of them, again, may seem quite banal, but I'd argue, is that any different to looking at mass data observation exercises on social media and trying to spot mood trends? There's an awful lot of detail in some of these materials. It's just really a case of accessing it to do research exercises that perhaps benefit the academy. But to a person, this is very interesting revelatory material about one's ancestors. So that's why they store up photos, letters, again, the sort of stuff that historians often go scrabbling around trying to find in archives and fail, because it's never been deposited. We rely so heavily on the state record, we forget about the personal record. So that is where there's this huge hinterland of research potential. Having gathered all this together, they then start constructing their research framework, which they call a family tree, and plot all of the information they know, or at least they think they know. And having worked with a number of celebrities on Who Do You Think You Are, it is astonishing how often they give a false date of birth. Most are considerably older than they claim to be. So there is a verification process. What is the evidence that has been assembled? Can we test it? And that leads to the official record. Birth, marriage, death indexes, which are now online, pushing further back into the early 20th century to try and link up to census data, again, digitised and available online. But crucially, this wonderful data set, the socio-economic history, has been presented to the world as a family history search engine. The means of access is by name, and if you're lucky, you might find some access by a house name or an address. As a data set, we could do far more with this information, but it is geared up to this one particular constituency. So in many ways, if we found a way of unlocking the potential of the census online, we'll be able to ask a lot more questions and start to match some of these results up. But with the family historian, you can then start to build a bigger picture around your ancestors, adding information not just about connectivity through the relationship to the head of the household, but also a geographical impact of where the family came from, also the social story of what they did for a living, and overlaying that with cartographic material and looking at local industries, you can start to build a picture of one's family's story from 1841 to 1911. And that then allows them, through various other pieces of data, such as place of birth and age, to then go into local sources, the ecclesiastical records of the church in all its various guises, the Anglican Church, nonconformist records, allowing you to plot baptism, marriage, burial. So the genealogist is already constructing quite a complicated research methodology, framework and goals, pushing back many centuries, far more than most academics would perhaps consider looking at during the course of their careers. I only took 1 year, for example. I exaggerate slightly, I've moved on to 1226. The next phase really is then to move from these national data sets to focus at the county archive level, or municipal record office, or specialist collection, whatever that may be. So the specialisation comes next, and this is following up those research clues, and that is where the questions of the historian come to the forefront. Why were they doing this? What can I find out about this? How do I apply this back to my knowledge? What was going on at a local or national level? If they aren't appearing on the 1881 census, why might that be? They're from a fairly poor background, perhaps they signed up to the army, what wars were going on, what's the local regiment? So in many ways there's this constant reappraisal of what it is they're trying to find out, but going ever more deeper into the archival record, bringing in increasingly secondary sources to try and contextualise what they've found. So this is a really compelling research journey. It isn't self-indulgent navel-gazing at all. It is really quite detailed. This is something we've tried to pick up when looking at making programmes like Who Do You Think You Are? But unfortunately, this is where two of the major influences start to come into play. Firstly, the impact of broadcast media. Now, this research journey is often hidden from the viewer, who's watched an episode of Who Do You Think You Are, and is often inspired to go on a similar journey. But of course, we're talking entertainment, not education. And it takes us months to research one case study. And if you're lucky, you might see 30 seconds of search footage on the screen. And some of the great howlers of the series, since it first aired in 2004, were firstly the brown paper envelope, produced as if by magic with all the relevant documentation inside, prompting viewers to phone up archives the next day, saying, could I have my family tree? I saw that Bilodi got his.
Yes, I want my brown envelope.
I want my brown envelope. They would turn up at the archives demanding it and not convinced. Or even worse, if you are showing a bit of process, it's a speeded up montage and you get the presenter walking into the doors of the archive and then appearing in the stacks, the closed off bits, pulling a book off the shelf at random, opening it up, and there is the information they need as if by magic. So all the process, all the reality is stripped out. So already we're getting a false message about the research process that up until 2004 was intrinsically part of the offline, non-broadcast media influenced researcher who was looking for house, local, or family information. So broadcast media shone the spotlight on why this is an amazing thing, but also gave a full sense of ease, and it takes away the reality of the archive experience, let alone the fact that they assumed that most archives were wood-panelled gentlemen's clubs for the ageing academic, looking a bit like Hogwarts Library, and of course when they are modern, brightly lit search rooms with windows and technology, they then set-dressed it to make it look like an old reading space. So you don't even get a sense of what an archive search room often looks like. Now the whole concept behind Who Do You Think You Are, I think, needs unpacking just a little bit, because it was never intended to be an education, how do you do, who do you think you are? So it was really intended to take the viewer on a journey into 10 strands of British social history, using a celebrity as a presenter and their ancestors to illustrate the point. So it was meant to be sort of a move away from the top-down, talking head historian approach to making programmes. They were meant to be on the side of the viewer, a bit like Tony Robinson on the Time Team, but their ancestors would illustrate that theme. And the 10 themes were fairly clear-cut. They had to be consistent throughout each episode. So a good example is Ian Hislop looking at military history. His mother had grown up in the Channel Islands during the Second World War, and they were of course occupied, so we have this incredible footage of what it must have been like living in occupied Britain under the Nazis in the 1940s, and what it meant for her and her friends, and the disappearances of the menfolk, so quite chilling stuff. Then we looked at his two grandfathers, one of whom sought frontline active service in France. He'd signed up to a Scottish regiment, so we took Ian across the channel to the village where his regiment had been billeted, where they've still got the Saltire, the Scottish Saltire, flying even to this day, and then marched him off to the front line, where we were able to match up an account of a particular battle from the operational orders contained in the unit war diaries. And we got him to almost relive that moment by reading out the commands as they went. So the idea had been that up until 0515, the British artillery would bombard the German lines at 05:30. The British troops would walk across and capture the lines. Unfortunately, they had miscalibrated the artillery guns and they had been pummelling behind the lines. So, of course, when the orders were given, the troops went across and started to get shot. Ian's grandfather was part of this. He was protected by a small copse of trees, hunkered down, and managed to make it back across under the cover of darkness later on that day. So we took Ian there, and this was a very emotional journey for him. It got him to think about warfare in a very different light. That sense of empathy that you don't often get just by reading a record or hearing a programme about it. It was experiential history. And this in many ways introduced a new way of approaching the past and a new motivation for actually looking at some of these stories. That episode went out in 2004, but of course now we're into the centenary commemorations for the First World War. Many people are going on frontline tours to try and find out where their ancestors would have been, to try and understand it not just from the British perspective, but from the German perspective as well, to get that empathy of what it must have been like. Ian's other grandfather was in the Boer War, and so we took him out to South Africa. And when Ian had been a boy, he'd written an essay about the Boer War, and it was all sort of gung-ho, daring-do stuff, boy's own adventure. You signed up for Queen and Country, you went off, you fought the Boers, you came back covered in medals, and he thought it was all very glorious. We took him out there, we again recounted the Battle of Spion-Kop in which he'd served, and he realised the full horror of what that actually meant. Going up the hill in dawn's early night, as the Boers came up the other side, they dug in, they killed each other in their thousands, and both sides melted away at dusk. There's not a single yard of ground gained by either side, and leaving thousands on the ground behind them. So a very sobering experience, but for us that wasn't enough to make a full programme, so we had to go and find something else. And we cast widely in his family tree. When we make the programmes, we try and work with family members who help us out. The celebrities know nothing about the process. Everything they see is revealed to them for the first time on screen. So we work with family members. And in this case, the relative had spotted another member of the family who had been involved in the army in the 18th century. And he had the name Murdo Matheson from Uig. Very unique name. So we went looking for him in the Army Service records. Eventually found him, and realised there were two Murdo Mathesons, both from Uig, who'd signed up at the same time. Luckily to the same regiment, which helped, so we were going to, the TV parlance was fudge it, and track the regiment to at least tell the story of what they were doing. But as it turned out, the two Murdo Mathesons would be separated into different battalions, so we had to get the right one. Anyway, we couldn't resolve it in the archive. We went back to the relative, who then very helpfully produced the guy's medals, which would have saved us quite a lot of searching, which had regimental details, service number, and of course the clasps of the battles. And he had also been in South Africa 100 years before Ian's grandfather. So that was a nice wrap-up to the story. But the idea was to introduce a theme of history and tell it with the presenter using the ancestors as an example. And in many ways, the next major change in personal heritage came with Bill Oddie, who wasn't interested in this approach at all. And we're committed to work with him. We wanted to tell the Industrial Revolution through his ancestors. The distant Oddies had been in Yorkshire. They'd worked the land, young farmers, and they'd done a bit of weaving on the side. Late 18th century, started the Industrial Revolution, and so the entrepreneurial Oddies crept across the border in the dead of night into Lancashire and signed up in the emerging mill towns and got work early on in the factories, which allowed them to work up the food chain, so they became middle managers, up until the point where the cotton famine struck in the 1860s, and most of the factories had to lay off their staff because no material was coming across the Atlantic as a result of the US Civil War and the blockade of the southern ports. So again, a nice piece of global history in a microcosm of someone's life. So it's from the micro to the macro all the time. The Oddie family made the brave decision to move on and try and find work rather than rely on the emerging soup kitchens and cooperative movement to help the unemployed. They managed to get some part-time work and started right at the bottom again. And so the cycle continued. Bill was the first to move away, and he was interested in none of this. He wanted to know about his mother, who'd had various mental health problems, which had affected him growing up to the point where he almost blamed her for some of his problems. This was a new take on personal heritage, a direct, one-generational issue that someone wanted to resolve with very precise questions, but with the sort of research that would normally have been resolved with a conversation. Now, this wasn't, for various reasons, possible. So we did a bit of background research and uncovered the mystery. And this was where we had this sleight of hand of the brown envelope. Bill was given 3 simple bits of paper. The first that he took out of the envelope was his parents' marriage certificate, which he knew about. The second was his sister's birth certificate, which came as a shock because he didn't have a sister. And the third document explained why. It was her death certificate 5 days after she had been born. And this was the family trauma that had triggered his mother's mental illness. Or at least the story unpacked itself that it was a misdiagnosis. Now, today, coupling postnatal depression with the trauma of losing a child, you would get counselling support. But in line with thinking of the time, going back 60 years or so, she was diagnosed as having a mental health problem and put into an asylum, which of course exacerbated the problem, so much so that she was in and out of the institutions for the rest of her life, but then subjected to all sorts of experimental therapy, electric shock therapy for example, which of course made it worse. Bill on various occasions was even brought in to see her as part of her therapy, which of course impacted upon him. Now, in discovering this, it was a major revelation, and it reappraised his view of his personal heritage. And for me, one of the most important statements ever made on Who Do You Think You Are comes at the end of his episode, where he says, he's on the train journey, having done all the other stuff, he can't get the thought of his mum out of his head. And he says, if I knew then what I know now, I could have made a difference. But now it's too late. And that message struck a chord with the viewing public. And again, the next day, thousands of people were asking where these records were, how they could do the research. This sparked a completely new take on personal heritage research, what is possible. This simple story, and a fairly anodyne collection of records that we found, suddenly sparked an upsurge of interest in how people can resolve real-life situations. And we found this week on week. People picking up on a research strand and then trying to apply it through their own practice. This, and it's difficult to remember 12 years ago, but this was the early days of the internet and certainly the mass data market. The 1901 census had just been launched, and we'd mentioned it in the second episode when we were looking at an illegitimacy story. And thousands of people logged on to try and do their own research, not after the program had finished, but whilst it was still going on. Truly interactive television. So broadcast media hugely influences people's research behaviour and activity. It shows them what they can do. It shows them the emotional journey is part of this process. And it also warns them that this emotional journey can provide all sorts of shocks, such as Jeremy Paxman's story in the following series, when we looked at extreme poverty through the prism of his 2 times great-grandmother, who had been bringing up 9 children on her own after her husband had died. She received a military pension for the 9 children, which was then stopped suddenly when it turned out that 2 of them had been born several years after he had died. We didn't go into too many reasons why that might be the case. We thought it best to leave it there, given it's Jeremy Paxman we're working with. But it allowed us to explore what happened next, which was the sense of poverty that she plunged into with the kids and the difficult decisions about splitting the family up. But it allowed us to show Jeremy Paxman in a very different light, this sort of revelatory moment when he realised that his nice, white, middle-class background was nothing but a 2-generational sham, and that for most of his ancestry there was real struggle and hardship. And he reappraised his own view about how poverty affects people, not just in the past, but in the present day. Again, it's empathy, but it's empathy that is applied, and that in many ways, from 2005 onwards, was the stimulus for a whole range of new projects starting to appear that took this concept that empathetic historical research applied at a personal level can actually change behaviours, and in many ways communities. I'll come back to those. The other major influence was, of course, the rise of the internet and associated technology, which went hand in hand with Who Do You Think You Are, making such a big impact on behavioural patterns of genealogical research. So instead of being led towards building a family tree, Who Do You Think You Are encouraged people to go on this emotional journey and visit places, so much so that it spawns ancestral tourism as a major industry. But at the same time, we find the awakening knowledge that to do this you need good quality data. And this is where we find 1837, which now has become far more past, and Ancestry, putting lots of money into digitising collections. And by 2008, this had become a major data market. This date is particularly key because it coincides with the financial crash and the age of austerity. And these things are all connected because the data market suddenly proved very attractive to archives who were facing catastrophic funding cuts. So the places which were traditionally the lifeblood of the personal heritage researcher were being closed or threatened with closure because funding was being switched to emergency frontline services, teachers, etc. However, it came at a cost. The model that was put forward was structured on a pay-per-view basis, in the sense that if an archival collection was digitised, the risk was borne by the dataset provider. In return, they would take the lion's share of all revenue generated from that, but as the data holder, the archive would get a percentage. When you start out down that route, there are only a few data sets, people pour in, there's a large revenue stream. Now the data market is flooded. Census, birth, marriage, death indexes, and increasingly parish registers are commoditised. They are the same across the site. So there's marginal return now for the dataset companies and even less for the data providers. And we're finding a very similar thing with other data sets. An instant hit and then a declining revenue return. So the archives are being bounced into a situation where they are, I wouldn't say selling their data, but finding a third-party portal to promote that data in return for a revenue stream. And that revenue stream is diminishing. And this has had a twofold impact. Firstly, visibility to their consumer base. Researchers no longer think that archives hold records in this constituency. I stood at Who Do You Think You Are Live at Olympia and listened, my jaw dropping open in wonder as people have come up to the National Archives stand saying, "Oh, you're the warehouse that holds the records for Ancestry, aren't you?" Absolutely true. And Tony Robinson on stage saying a few times, "We won't need the National Archives very soon, we'll have all the records digitised." So that's one concern I will park there now, because the impact is very much on the archives and the provision of services. Now you'd think with this revenue coming in it was a nice, bright, rosy future, but actually the opposite is the case. Because with the audience shifting from a face-to-face, hands-on approach to going into an archive and finding information, they now stay at home and use Ancestry or Find My Past to access that information. So they no longer go to the archives, who are looking at falling numbers, therefore making it harder to justify opening their search rooms. Yet equally, the data that has been put online tends to be name-rich and quite narrow. And so the second phase, that specialised phase where they use local knowledge or social history to really go rooting around in wonderful stuff that is quite unique, simply is now unobtainable or becoming less so. Equally, we have this tension between search and research. And despite us starting out with this wonderful emotional journey in 2004, with the rise of the internet provider, we're now looking very much at a linear search pattern, i.e. if you're looking for someone, you go to Ancestry, you throw in a name, that comes in results, you are encouraged then to import those into your family tree, which they will post, plus also other family information. And so we're now back to a very linear name-gathering exercise. There's no scope for the creativity of storytelling or historical appraisal, or indeed the sharing of that information with other like-minded researchers. And this is why I say it's really important we differentiate between search versus research. The research are the skills one uses to ask the question and find the sources and possibly use a bit online, but mainly to drill down into the physical records. Whereas the online search is a very different beast. And people are making false assumptions about connectivity or missing data because it's either poorly transcribed or it's transcribed accurately but they haven't understood it. So we find lots of people wondering why they're now related to the Ditto family in the 1901 census. Transcribe what you see, it's perfectly valid, but perhaps not applied that well in the indexes to support the metadata. And we're also finding people are now questioning access to their data. Who owns the data that goes onto these platforms? It's a perennial issue, and I think Bruce Willis first flagged this up when he was found that he was not able to bequeath his iTunes collection to his offspring, and now people are waking up to the fact that every photograph, every snippet of personal information they put into Ancestry is technically owned by Ancestry. They can try and take stuff off, but it will be on the server somewhere, particularly if someone else has linked to it. So who owns the data? It may not well be you anymore. So people are a bit nervous about this. So we're moving into a very interesting situation about the manipulation of data for an audience which is becoming a little bit scared by the outcomes, who are now going back to an old style of research methodology, as in search rather than research. Yet, the wonderful stuff that is being unearthed by this new process over the last 12 years is now out of reach of the academy, both in terms of the state data that has been put on because the paywall is a barrier, and the search engines are a barrier. We'd love to do all sorts of free search on census data or on criminal records, but it's really frustrating. The Digital Panopticon project, which has been set up out of the University of Liverpool, number of different institutions working on it, they are frantically trying to unlock some of the criminal records which have been digitised with Find My Past, but simply cannot do so because of the licence agreement made between the platform and the host, the archive in its own right. And so it's almost beginning to stifle the academic requirement to ask questions of data. So as we move into an open data environment, archives, and possibly by extension academic libraries as well, who are looking at some of these solutions, are locking themselves out of new research. Equally, there is a challenge around how we develop impact. And this, I think, the challenge becomes an opportunity. What is the role of the academy in this new hinterland of personal heritage? Well, firstly, I think we can promote and expand upon the research skills as opposed to search. In the library, for example, we run inductions and we encourage our new postgrads to research effectively. Not just about how to find things, but how to apply research questions. And this is now forming much more of a part of the good researcher landscape, some of the doctoral training partnerships, for example. This is a skill set that we could, and I would argue should, be reintroducing back into the family, local, social, house, history, market, to wean people off the online data sets, or at least show them that this is the first step on a much larger research journey, and work in partnership with the archives, firstly to help them encourage researchers back in, to keep them open for our own selfish needs, to see the medieval exchequer stuff which will never be digitised, but equally to start looking at alternative research packages that allow us access to data in a different way. So there's an advocacy and a skills provision role that the academy could and should be playing. There's also a role in recognising the importance of personal and user-generated data and materials. Like I've said on a number of occasions, research projects can actually focus to an incredible degree on the state record, but actually the balance should be towards the personal as well. And to give you an example of that, BBC did a project, People's War, again about sort of 10 years or so ago, looking at the impact of the Second World War and getting people's stories, home front and military. And we just did a couple of samples of the case studies that were appearing. One was of a particular day on a particular battle where 6 vets from the same brigade all posted their memories of what happened. Very interesting to see how they overlap. So they disagreed on certain points. It was personal perspective and there was a long distance between when it happened and their recollection. But you did get a sense of a kernel of shared memory starting to appear. Because of the way it was curated, it wasn't people feeding off each other's memories. They were all separately uploaded and we brought them together to see if we could compare. So like a good Venn diagram, the concentric circle in the middle is what you would like to imagine is what happened from their perspective. Compare that moment with the official unit or diary and it was completely different. Completely different. And that's why the importance of these two approaches needs to be melded back together again. So by supporting the acquisition and dissemination of user-generated content, but being able to then ask research questions of it, possibly through some sort of academic hub where people can upload content to either lock it down for safekeeping, but to open it up or elements of it up to the research community in return for training and skill sets and impact. It just creates a nice model. It allows the academy to create impact and demonstrate visibility, connectivity with a different user group, but equally to bring in new material and make sure that it's integrated more effectively. This will also filter down to on-the-ground projects. And I've got a couple I'd just like to share with you before I conclude. One of them focuses on schools, and we haven't got that up, sorry. Why is that not working? Let me just delete this. Let me just bring it up. There we go. This is a project called Making History, and the aim is to introduce some of the elements of genealogical research into schools, particularly for those who aren't necessarily following, how can I say, a more academic route, a more practice-based approach. Because it is about skills. It's not just about finding stuff about one's background. Working on genealogical research in schools is difficult. There are ethical issues. You've got problems for those who don't necessarily reflect the sort of background that you see on Who Do You Think You Are, which relies on state-registered material. But actually, the focus of Making History is about storytelling. Everyone has a story. And it was really interesting working with a number of groups, particularly in and around London, where you have large numbers of multi-ethnic groups in a classroom with different languages and different stories about how their community ended up in that particular place. To bring them together and to share the commonality of where you are allows the differences of one's background to find a home. And by introducing some of the research skills and also showing how you can use ICT to bring it to life, it's changed the lives of a whole range of children that we've worked with. Now there's a role for the Academy to play in supporting this, but also in analysing the research trends. We've worked with a number of kids who were probably going to leave school with poor qualifications, who were turned around by this to become peer group leaders and go on to university to read history and technology. I can give several examples from this. It would be great to actually see how they continue, or to analyse some of the techniques and then see whether this can be applied at a much larger level. At the moment, this pilot is running in rural Lincolnshire and in Hackney, I believe, and there are plans to extend across other regions as well. But there are lots of these projects out there, and the great thing about this one is that for the Lincoln leg, they have matched up with University of Lincoln and have started to use some of their media team to help with the training, and also starts with analysing the research results in the first 2 years of the pilot. I mentioned ancestral tourism, and this is again, I think, a really interesting area that the Academy can get involved with, looking at how personal heritage will motivate people to spend money. And this goes back to some of the empathetic approaches that I've mentioned already. In Ireland, it's big business. The Irish government have digitised a lot of their records, put them online, so people will find their roots and come home, particularly those who were part of the diaspora in the mid-19th century following the potato famine and all the terrible disease and starvation that went with it. So they're encouraging those who went to the land of opportunity in America, made good, and now can be enticed back to see their ancestral homelands, either to go and do some ancestral trails, or if they're not interested, to go and play golf or sample local food or cuisine or whatever it is. It's amazing how often you see the genealogy ticket matched up with the leisure offer as well. So it is big business tourism. You can also buy your certificate of Irishness online once you've gone back 2 generations to feel part of a national story. Wouldn't it be great, again, if we could start to analyse these trends? it's also very big in Scotland. There's an estimated 50 million diaspora Scots descendants out there. And during their last homecoming exercise in 2014, there was a deliberate campaign by Visit Scotland to reach out to this community and bring them back. I think they were told at one point of giving them the vote in the referendum of that year. That might be anecdotal, I wouldn't like to comment. That's probably going to be edited out. But again, there's a very strong national story. 2014, the anniversary of Bannockburn. So there's a juxtaposition, there's a common theme here. The English and the Irish were bad, the Irish suffered, same with the Scots. So there's a national story starting to emerge, but it brings people back to then partake of their national emblems. So there was an upsurge in sales of clan tartans, and whisky, and all sorts of things. Heritage trails sprung up. They didn't quite go as far as recreating what they did in 2009, which was the gathering of the clans, the first time since the Battle of Culloden. We all know how that ended. So I think there was a residual nervousness about trying to repeat such historical reenactment again. But it was very, very successful. There was a big investment in it. The one sector that was largely missing was higher education. And it would have been a fantastic opportunity to look at creating MOOCs, for example, to help educate people in the heritage they wish to reclaim. So there is actually an academic and a pseudo-commercial benefit from doing this. The final project I want to sort of run past you is quite an organic one, but it brings all of these strands together. It's the Ryde Social Heritage Group, winner of the Archive of the Year in 2014. And this solves a real-life community problem. And the application of personal heritage research using a digital environment came together in this group, who were founded 12 years or so ago, to tackle the problem of vandalism in the local cemetery. And the kids, with nothing much to do, were going in there, kicking over the headstones, defacing them, and the concerned locals wanted to at least capture the transcriptions on those gravestones before they went. So it came very much out of a genealogical quest to preserve data. They got a very small grant to do so, and out of that they got volunteers together to go around and do the transcription process, and then they created a website, and they put that information online themselves. And they were astonished to find a growing number of people asking whether those gravestones stood and whether they could come and visit them, whether there would be someone there to help interpret the life of the people that they've connected with. So very quickly this turned into an ancestral tourism opportunity, and people were coming not in the summer season but in the shoulder seasons when hotels were cheaper. They were filling empty rooms off the back of this website. And the local council sat up and took notice and thought, this is something quite useful. And they invested a further £60,000 in renovating the graveyard, but also renovating the 2 Victorian chapels that were there. And they gave one of them to the group to set up a permanent local study centre, which allowed them to become more ambitious. And they then started on oral history projects, working with the schools to use the kids to interview older members of the community and then create a growing archive. More than that, they were then given the second space, the second chapel, to create the graveyard classroom itself, where many lessons were held, not just about local history, but about numeracy, working off old materials to count up an account book for the overseers of the poor. Nature trails in the graveyards. There was a family of slow worms that were habitually disturbed when the flagstone was British and they'd slither. Art, drawing some of the headstones, all sorts of things. And they found that very quickly vandalism stopped, but actually the local youth groups were coming up to them saying, well, can we do more to help you? Peering in the middle of the street, I've got some more information for you, rather intimidating some of them found it at first. And as a result, this has brought together a whole range of benefits, to the point where they won Archive of the Year in 2014. The success of this was a community identifying a problem, getting some seed corn funding to create a website with really useful data that they controlled. They had the visibility, they weren't lost behind the ancestry banner, which allowed them to manipulate that data to generate further economic footfall by bringing in tourists, to then reinvest in education so that the whole cycle rebooted itself. The only thing that was missing, once again, was the academic analysis and research support. But that has finally come in place, with the University of Portsmouth starting to take an interest in sending students over to monitor the group. So really, as a closing thought, the personal heritage research environment of the 21st century is predominantly digital, but because it's predominantly digital, the research element needs really to be promoted by the academy, as indeed do many of the outcomes and outputs that will benefit the practitioners that, up until the last 10 years, have never really been a core part of our audience, or indeed potential research community that can be mobilised. I haven't even addressed things such as crowdsourcing, mass transcription projects, the ability to put data up there and open it out. Equally, the open agenda, open access to research outputs, to research data management tools, so that it can reach a wider audience. Is that effective? Or possibly not. Because people aren't necessarily interested in the language of the academy. There needs to be a further level of interpretation. So, hopefully that's posed a few questions. I know I've talked far longer than you would like me to. But with any luck, that will stimulate a little bit of debate about what has happened, but more particularly from my side, what it is we might effectively look to do in the future.
Thank you.